Earth Station Omega hung like a gleaming pearl against the velvet backdrop of space, its crystalline towers reflecting the distant starlight. In Laboratory Module 7, Zara adjusted her optical sensors, her iridescent scales shifting from azure to violet with concentration. As the station's leading xenobiologist from the Andromedian Science Academy, she had analyzed countless species, but humans continued to fascinate her. The holoscreen before her displayed a complex array of biochemical readings, each one more perplexing than the last. She absent-mindedly ran a hand through her feather-like hair, a characteristic of her species that seemed to entrance the humans as much as their peculiarities intrigued her. "Dr. Zara?" The deep voice startled her from her contemplation. Lieutenant James Harrison stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. "I heard you requested a volunteer for your research." Zara's scales flickered with interest, creating a rippling pattern of blue and silver. James Harrison was exactly what she needed for her research, young, healthy, and according to her preliminary scans, producing exceptional levels of the compound she was studying. "Lieutenant Harrison, yes, please come in." She gestured to the examination chair with one of her 4 arms while using another to adjust the lab's environmental controls. "I've been studying human biochemistry, particularly a fascinating compound your species produces naturally." James settled into the chair, his dark eyes watching her movements with curiosity. "Just James is fine. And which compound would that be?" Zara's scales shimmered with excitement as she approached, scanning device in hand. "Your species produces a unique protein-rich fluid that seems to have remarkable properties. We've nothing like it in the Andromeda system. The cellular regeneration potential alone is extraordinary." James's eyebrows shot up as realization dawned. "Dr. Zara, are you talking about human male reproductive fluid?" "Yes," she finished matter-of-factly, her scales now pulsing with a soft pink glow that betrayed her enthusiasm. "The properties are remarkable. The protein content, the adaptive capabilities, the regenerative cycle, it's unlike anything we've encountered." James coughed, his face flushing red. "I wasn't expecting this kind of research when I volunteered." Zara tilted her head, her feather hair swaying with the movement. "Is this topic taboo? My cultural briefing indicated that humans have moved past primitive reproductive shame. Was that incorrect?" "No, not exactly," James managed, finding himself oddly charmed by her scientific directness. "It's just, usually there's dinner first." Zara's scales flickered in confusion. "Dinner? Is nutrient consumption necessary for sample collection?" "My research indicated the production process was independent of immediate caloric intake." James couldn't help but laugh, the tension breaking. "It was a joke, Dr. Zara. Human humor, we often use it in awkward situations." "Fascinating." Zara's scales brightened to a brilliant turquoise. "Would you explain the correlation between dining and reproduction? Is it a cultural construct or biological imperative?" As James attempted to explain human dating customs to the increasingly intrigued xenobiologist, he found himself drawn to her genuine curiosity and intelligent questions. Her scales shifted through a rainbow of colors as she processed new information, and her enthusiasm was infectious. "Perhaps," Zara suggested after their discussion had wandered far from the original research topic, "we should conduct this investigation over dinner, as per your species' customs." "For scientific accuracy, of course." James smiled, noting how her scales blushed a deep rose at her own suggestion. "For science, then. Though I should warn you, studying human courtship rituals can be quite complex." "Excellent. I find complex subjects particularly engaging." Zara began entering notes into her datapad. "Shall we begin with this dinner protocol at 1900 hours? The station's observation deck provides an adequate setting for human romantic interactions, according to my research." As James agreed to their research dinner, he couldn't help but wonder if he was the one being studied, or if there was something more developing between them. Zara's scales shifted to a warm golden hue as she smiled, and he decided that perhaps being part of her research wouldn't be so bad after all. Later, as she updated her research logs, Zara found herself adding personal observations about human facial expressions, particularly the way James's eyes crinkled when he smiled. For purely scientific reasons, of course. She told herself the warm flutter in her thoracic cavity when she thought about their dinner appointment was merely professional excitement about potential research developments. But even xenobiologists could be wrong sometimes. The observation deck of Earth Station Omega offered a breathtaking view of Earth below, its blue-green surface swirled with white clouds. But Zara found her attention repeatedly drawn to James, who sat across from her at the small table, the starlight playing across his features. "You're scanning me again," he noted with amusement, taking a sip of his wine. The restaurant's soft lighting cast a warm glow over their table, making Zara's scales shimmer with subtle iridescence. "My ocular movements are involuntary data collection," she defended, her scales flushing a gentle pink. "Your species has fascinating micro-expressions. For instance, the current elevation of your right eyebrow indicates either skepticism or playful disagreement. Which is it?" James laughed, a sound that triggered an unexpected flutter in Zara's secondary cardiovascular system. "Maybe both. You know, most humans don't spend their first date analyzing facial muscles." "This isn't a date," Zara corrected quickly, her scales flickering rapidly through shades of blue and violet. "It's a preliminary investigation into human social customs as they relate to biological processes. Speaking of which..." She pulled out her data pad. James gently placed his hand over the device, lowering it to the table. His touch sent a surprising tingle through Zara's sensory receptors. "Maybe we could conduct this investigation without the scientific equipment. Just talk." Zara's feather hair rustled with uncertainty. "But how will I record the data?" "Some things are better experienced than recorded," James suggested, his voice softening. "Like this wine, or the view, or..." He hesitated, then smiled, "or the way your scales change color when you're nervous." "I'm not nervous," Zara protested, even as her scales betrayed her with a ripple of rose gold. "I'm simply maintaining professional objectivity while studying a fascinating biological phenomenon." "Which phenomenon would that be?" James asked, leaning forward slightly. "The accelerated cardiac rhythm humans experience during close social interaction," Zara replied automatically, then paused. "Although, I'm finding my own physiological responses rather distracting." A group of off-duty engineers walked past their table, their curious glances not going unnoticed. Station gossip about the xenobiologist's research had spread quickly, leading to no small amount of speculation about her dinner with the lieutenant. "They're curious about us," Zara observed, her scientific mind automatically analyzing the social dynamics. "Human society places great emphasis on mating rituals and pair bonding." James nearly choked on his wine. "This isn't. I mean, we're not." "No, of course not," Zara agreed quickly, her scales darkening to a deep purple. "This is purely professional. Although..." She hesitated, then continued with scientific precision, "I find myself experiencing unusual biochemical responses in your presence. My hormone levels are quite irregular." James's expression softened. "Is that your way of saying you like me?" "Like is an imprecise term," Zara replied, her scales now shimmering with gold highlights. "But yes, I believe that's an accurate approximation of my current emotional state." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their meals, standard Earth cuisine for James and a specially prepared Andromedian dish for Zara. She watched with fascination as James navigated his food with only 2 arms. "Would you like to try some?" he offered, holding out a forkful of his pasta. Zara's scales flickered with surprise. Sharing food is a significant gesture in many human cultures, she noted, even as she leaned forward to accept the bite. The flavors were extraordinary, unlike anything in her experience. "And in Andromedian culture?" James asked, watching her reaction. In my culture, we generally don't. Zara started to explain, then stopped herself. Actually, perhaps some things don't require scientific analysis. As the evening progressed, Zara found herself taking fewer notes and paying more attention to the way James's eyes caught the starlight, how his laugh made her scales ripple with colors she hadn't known they could produce, and how the simple brush of his hand against hers sent cascades of sensation through her nervous system. By the time they stood to leave, Zara had completely forgotten about her original research objectives. Her datapad remained untouched on the table, its screen dark with disuse. "I should thank you," she said as they walked toward the residential section. "This has been most informative." "Is that your scientific assessment?" James teased. Zara's scales shimmered with a new color, one she'd never displayed before, a soft, warm glow that seemed to come from within. "No," she admitted. "That was just me." As they reached her quarters, Zara realized she had collected very little useful data for her research. Somehow, that didn't seem to matter anymore. The most significant discovery of the evening had nothing to do with biology or biochemistry, it was the realization that some things transcended scientific observation. "Would you be interested in conducting further research?" she asked, her scales betraying her uncertainty with flickers of silver. James smiled, and Zara's internal sensors registered several simultaneous physiological responses that she decided not to analyze. "I'd like that," he said. "Though maybe next time we can leave the datapad behind." "That would be acceptable," Zara agreed, her scales settling into a peaceful, luminescent blue. "For science, of course." "Of course," James echoed, his smile suggesting he knew as well as she did that science had very little to do with it anymore. The rumors spread through Earth Station Omega faster than a quantum transmission. By the time Zara arrived at her laboratory the next morning, her research into human biology had become the subject of considerable speculation. "Dr. Zara." Professor Thax, her Rigelian colleague, waved three of his tentacles in greeting. "I hear your research into human reproductive biology is progressing, intimately." His bioluminescent spots pulsed with barely contained amusement. Zara's scales flickered with indignation. "My research methods are entirely professional," she insisted, though her scales betrayed her with a flash of pink at the memory of dinner with James. Of course," Thax agreed, his spots still pulsing. "Though I must say, dining with your research subject is an unconventional methodology." Before Zara could defend her scientific integrity, her laboratory's communication panel chimed. The face of Director Venn, her superior at the Andromedian Science Academy, filled the screen. Dr. Zara, the elderly Andromedian scales were a stern gray. "We've received some interesting reports about your research methods. The Academy is concerned." Zara straightened her posture, her scales settling into a professional blue. "Director, I assure you my research is proceeding according to established protocols." "Dating your research subject is hardly protocol," Director Venn interrupted, her scales flickering with disapproval. "Need I remind you of the incident with Dr. Xylos and the Venusian ambassador?" "This is different," Zara protested, then immediately regretted her choice of words. "I mean, there is no dating involved. Lieutenant Harrison and I merely shared a meal while discussing human biological processes." "Lieutenant Harrison, is it?" Director Venn's scales took on a knowing shimmer. "Not subject H-237 as per your previous reports." Before Zara could formulate a response, the laboratory door slid open, and James walked in. His uniform was pressed crisp, but his expression was troubled. "Dr. Zara, do you have a moment?" He glanced at the communication screen. "Oh, I apologize for interrupting." Director Venn's scales rippled with interest. "Not at all, Lieutenant. We were just discussing you." The screen went dark before Zara could object. James turned to Zara, running a hand through his dark hair. "We need to talk. The station's rumor mill is working overtime." My commanding officer just asked me if I was compromising myself for alien research. Zara's scales darkened with embarrassment. James, I never meant to. I know, he said softly. But maybe we should clear things up. What exactly is this between us? Research? Or something else? Zara's scales churned with conflicting colors as she struggled to categorize their relationship. My initial interest was scientific, she admitted. Your species' biological capabilities are fascinating. But now I find myself conducting unauthorized observations, she confessed, her scales shimmering with vulnerability. Like how your voice causes unexpected fluctuations in my hormone levels. Or how your proximity affects my thermal regulation. These reactions aren't part of my approved research parameters. James stepped closer, and Zara's sensors registered the familiar acceleration of her cardiac rhythms. Maybe some things aren't meant to be researched, he suggested. Maybe they're just meant to be felt. That's highly unscientific, Zara pointed out, even as her scales bloomed with warm colors. Science isn't everything, James replied, reaching out to touch her face gently. Her scales shimmered beneath his fingers, creating patterns of light that reflected in his eyes. The moment was interrupted by Professor Thax clearing his throat, or what passed for a throat in Rigelian anatomy. Fascinating biometric readings, Dr. Zara, he commented, his spots pulsing with undisguised interest. Shall I include them in the department's weekly report? James quickly stepped back, and Zara's scales flashed with mortification. That won't be necessary, Professor, she managed to say. After Thax had slithered away, James turned back to Zara. You know, on Earth, we have a saying, the heart wants what the heart wants. Humans have multiple sayings about every organ, Zara observed, attempting to retreat into scientific detachment. Though I fail to see how a muscle's desires could. James silenced her with a kiss. Zara's scales exploded in a rainbow of colors, her scientific mind cataloging every sensation even as her emotional centers threatened to overload. When they finally separated, she blinked rapidly, trying to process what had happened. That was highly irregular, she breathed, her scales still flickering with aftershocks. Good irregular or bad irregular? James asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Zara considered the question with all the scientific rigor she could muster, which wasn't much given her current state. I believe further investigation is required, she decided, pulling him back for another kiss. From that moment on, Zara's research took a decidedly unorthodox turn. Her reports to the Academy became increasingly vague, full of references to ongoing observations and long-term study requirements. And if her scales happened to glow with unprecedented colors whenever a certain lieutenant was nearby, well, that was merely an interesting scientific anomaly worth further investigation. The encrypted transmission arrived during Earth Station Omega's night cycle, its urgency override bypassing Zara's privacy settings. As her quarters lights automatically activated, the message materialized before her. Project Genesis Priority Alpha. Human biological capabilities exceed initial projections. Accelerate research. Full cellular samples required. Authorization, High Council. Zara's scales paled to an ashen gray as she read the message. Her four hands trembled slightly as she thought of James, no longer just a research subject or even just her partner, but now potentially the key to her species' survival. The truth she'd been avoiding crashed down around her, the Andromedian population was failing. A genetic degradation had been slowly killing their ability to reproduce, and human biology might hold the cure. Her research had never been merely academic. A soft chime announced a visitor. The door slid open to reveal James, holding 2 cups of coffee, a human habit she'd grown fond of. I thought you might be awake, he said, then paused, noticing her disturbed scales. What's wrong? Zara quickly dismissed the holographic message, but her scales continued to betray her distress. James, we need to discuss something important. He set down the coffee and moved to her side, concern etched on his features. I'm listening. My research. She began, then stopped, her scales rippling with anxiety. It's not just scientific curiosity. My people, we're dying. Our reproductive capabilities are failing, and human biology might hold the key to our survival. James absorbed this information silently, his expression unreadable. And us? Was any of this real, or was I just a convenient research subject? No. Zara's scales flashed with intense emotion, creating patterns she'd never displayed before. I mean, yes, initially, but everything changed. You changed everything. She reached out with all four hands, grasping his arms gently. What I feel for you, it's not research. It's not duty. It's love. James suggested softly. Zara's scales erupted in a brilliant display of colors. Love is an imprecise term, she whispered, but yes, I believe that's exactly what it is. James pulled her close, and Zara felt her biorhythms synchronizing with his heartbeat, a phenomenon she'd never documented in her research but had come to cherish. So what do we do now? He asked against her feather hair. The High Council wants biological samples, she admitted. They believe human reproductive capabilities might be able to restore our own. James couldn't help but laugh, despite the situation's gravity. You know, when you first started studying human nectar, I never imagined it could save an entire species. Zara's scales flushed deep purple with embarrassment. This is serious, James. The Council's authorization means they're desperate. They'll send others if I don't comply. Then we'll face them together, James said firmly. But this time, we do it honestly. No more hidden agendas. We bring this to Station Command, make it official. A legitimate research partnership between our species. You do that? Zara's scales shimmered with hope. Even after learning the truth. Zara, helping save your species would be the easiest decision I've ever made. He smiled. Though I have to admit, the research methods might be more enjoyable than standard protocol. Her scales flickered with amusement and affection. I'll need to update my research parameters. And possibly requisition a larger bed. Now that's the kind of scientific thinking I can appreciate, James laughed, pulling her closer. As they stood together, Earth rotating slowly in the viewport behind them, Zara realized that sometimes the greatest discoveries weren't found in laboratory data or biological samples, but in the unexpected connections that transcended species, space, and scientific protocol. She would save her people, not through deception or hidden agendas, but through honest collaboration and trust. And perhaps, in doing so, she would discover something even more valuable, a bridge between two worlds, built on understanding, respect, and love. The coffee grew cold on the table, forgotten as they began planning their presentation to Station Command. Zara's scales glowed with a steady, peaceful light, the color of certainty, of purpose, and of love. The Station Command conference room buzzed with tension as representatives from Earth and Andromeda faced each other across the gleaming table. Holograms of both worlds rotated slowly above the center, casting alternating blue and green lights across the assembled faces. Station Commander Reeves leaned forward, her stern expression softening as she reviewed the proposal before her. Let me get this straight. The Andromedian species is facing extinction due to genetic degradation, and human biology might hold the cure. Correct, Zara confirmed, her scales maintaining a professional blue despite her nervousness. James stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Our initial research suggests human reproductive capabilities could be adapted to restore our species' genetic viability. Director Ven's hologram flickered as she joined the conversation from Andromeda. The situation is dire. Our population has declined by 30% in the last decade. Without intervention, we face extinction within 3 generations. Commander Reeves turned to James. And you're volunteering to be the primary donor for this research, Lieutenant? Yes, ma'am, James replied firmly. Though Dr. Zara and I propose expanding the program to include more volunteers, with proper protocols and oversight. I bet you do, someone muttered from the back of the room, triggering a ripple of quickly suppressed laughter. Zara's scales flushed briefly before she regained composure. Our preliminary results are promising. We've already identified the key components in human reproductive fluid that could potentially restore our genetic stability. Speaking of preliminary results, Director Venn interjected, her scales showing a hint of amusement, your recent research methods have been unconventional, Dr. Zara. Love often is, James responded before Zara could speak, taking her hand. Her scales rippled with warmth at his touch. Commander Reeves raised an eyebrow. This is more than just a research partnership, then. It is, Zara acknowledged, her scales glowing with a deep, steady gold. Which is why we're proposing something beyond just biological research. We want to establish a permanent cultural exchange program, using our work as a foundation for deeper understanding between our species. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about saving one species anymore, it was about bringing two worlds together. Hours later, after agreements had been signed and protocols established, Zara and James stood in her laboratory, looking out at the stars. Well, that went better than expected, James mused, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Though I could have done without the jokes about hands-on research. Zara's scales shimmered with happiness. Humans do seem preoccupied with reproductive humor. I've documented at least 47 distinct variations of. James silenced her with a kiss, a method he'd found remarkably effective at interrupting her scientific tangents. You know, he said when they finally parted, there's still one experiment we haven't tried. Zara's scales flickered with curiosity. Oh. Marriage, he said simply. A permanent merger of our research interests, you might say. Zara's scales exploded in a dazzling display of colors. That would be highly irregular, she managed to say. Cross-species unions are unprecedented in both our cultures. Since when has that stopped us? James grinned. Besides, think of the research opportunities. A lifetime study? Zara pretended to consider it scientifically. It would require extensive data collection, prolonged observation periods, and numerous, physical experiments. I'm willing to volunteer, James murmured, pulling her closer. For science, she teased, her scales glowing with joy. For love, he corrected, and kissed her again. As Earth Station Omega continued its eternal orbit, a new chapter in human-Andromedian relations began. The official records would show breakthrough research in genetic restoration and groundbreaking developments in cross-species medicine. But the real story, of how love transcended biology, overcame cultural barriers, and built a bridge between worlds, that would become legend. And if anyone noticed that Dr. Zara's research reports became increasingly poetic, or that Lieutenant Harrison developed an impressive knowledge of Andromedian physiology, well, that was just another fascinating example of cross-cultural exchange. In the end, Zara discovered that the greatest scientific breakthrough wasn't found in a test tube or under a microscope, but in the simple truth that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in any galaxy. Her final report to the Academy contained just one line: some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be lived. The end.